For 15 years, Dr. Harrison had proudly declared, "I am my own God in this operating room." He saved lives through science, not prayer. But when his perfect record shattered and his first patient died on the table, someone appeared who would prove him devastatingly wrong about who really controls life and death. Dr. Michael Harrison's eyes opened at exactly 5:30 a.m. without an alarm. At 45, precision controlled every aspect of his life. His penthouse overlooked Lake Michigan, sterile, minimalist, perfect. No family photos, no religious artifacts, nothing suggesting faith beyond scientific fact. This wasn't accidental. As Reverend David Harrison's son, young Michael had once believed fervently in God. That faith died when he was 15, finding his father's empty closet and a note, "I cannot continue living a lie, find your own truth." His mother prayed for 3 years for her husband's return, dying of a broken heart while still believing. Michael learned a devastating truth: God either couldn't help those who trusted him or simply didn't care. The only person he could depend on was himself. That lesson drove him through medical school at Johns Hopkins, where he graduated first, through surgical residency working 100-hour weeks, into becoming Chicago Memorial's most successful surgeon with an absolutely perfect record, 3,247 surgeries without losing a single patient. "I am my own God in this operating room," he told medical students. And gods don't lose patience. Tuesday morning began routinely. After his calculated workout and breakfast, Dr. Harrison reviewed the schedule: gallbladder removal for Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, 73, retired elementary school teacher. Her file showed minimal complications, routine laparoscopic procedure, 90 minutes expected. At Chicago Memorial, respect followed Dr. Harrison everywhere. Nurses stepped aside, residents scrambled to assist, colleagues sought his opinion. This was his kingdom where his word was absolute law. Mrs. Whitman's family arrived early. Dr. Patricia Williams, chief of surgery, informed him near the elevators, "They're quite nervous and specifically requested to speak with you before the procedure." In conference room B, the family waited anxiously, daughter Jennifer with worried eyes etched by months of concern, son Robert in a business suit suggesting he'd taken time off work, and youngest daughter Amy, barely 20, fighting back tears. "Thank you for seeing us," Jennifer said, rising quickly to shake his hand. "We know how incredibly busy you must be." Dr. Harrison assured them of the routine nature, excellent success rates, minimal complications. He explained the laparoscopic approach, recovery timeline, and answered their detailed questions with practiced confidence. Dr. Amy whispered hesitantly, "Grandmother is very religious. She's been praying constantly since we scheduled this surgery. Could we say a prayer together before you operate?" Dr. Harrison suppressed his usual irritation at such requests. While prayer served no medical purpose, refusing would unnecessarily distress an already anxious family. "Of course, your grandmother's spiritual comfort is important for her well-being. I'll rely on medical science and surgical technique, but I have no objection to your family finding comfort in faith." Relief flooded their faces. "Thank you so much," Jennifer smiled genuinely for the first time. "Mama always says God works through skilled doctors' hands to perform healing miracles." Dr. Harrison nodded politely while thinking, if God worked through doctors, why had he abandoned a preacher's family when they desperately needed him most? His surgical team assembled with military precision in the pre-operative area. Dr. Sarah Chen, his anesthesiologist for 8 years, confirmed Mrs. Whitman's excellent vital signs. Nurse Rebecca Martinez, a former Navy medic with 20 years of operating room experience, had prepared instruments with obsessive attention to detail. Medical student Dr. James Patterson would observe his first surgery with the legendary Harrison, standard laparoscopic cholecystectomy. Dr. Harrison announced to his team, "Routine procedure, expected duration 90 minutes to 2 hours maximum. Any concerns?" The team reported ready status across all systems. Equipment calibrated, blood work normal, anesthesia plan appropriate for her age and medical history. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman was wheeled into operating room 7 at exactly 8:30 a.m. Despite pre-operative anxiety medication, she remained alert, clear blue eyes taking in the impressive array of medical technology that would soon focus entirely on her care. "How are you feeling this morning, Mrs. Whitman?" Dr. Harrison asked, approaching the operating table with his practiced reassuring smile. "A little nervous," she admitted honestly. voice slightly affected by medication but still coherent. But my family told me you're the very best surgeon in Chicago, so I'm trying not to worry. Your family is very kind, Dr. Harrison replied warmly. This is a procedure I've performed many times with consistently excellent results. Dr. Chen will help you fall asleep comfortably now, and when you wake up, your gallbladder problems will be completely behind you. Mrs. Whitman nodded trustingly, and closed her eyes as Dr. Chen began carefully administering general anesthesia. Within minutes, she was unconscious, breathing controlled by sophisticated ventilator equipment, vital signs clearly displayed on multiple monitors throughout the operating room. All right, everyone, Dr. Harrison announced with quiet confidence, let's begin this procedure. The first surgical incision was made at precisely 8:47 a.m. with the technical precision that had become Dr. Harrison's trademark. Using a small trocar, he created the initial port for the laparoscopic camera, insufflating the abdomen with carbon dioxide to create working space around the gallbladder. The camera provided crystal clear, high-definition images of Mrs. Whitman's internal anatomy on large monitors positioned around the room. Beautiful visualization, Dr. Patterson commented, genuinely impressed by the image clarity. Equipment is only as effective as the surgeon using it, Dr. Harrison replied, pleased with the compliment, while establishing 3 additional working ports at precisely calculated locations. Throughout this initial phase, Mrs. Whitman's vital signs remained perfectly stable: blood pressure 125/78, heart rate 68, oxygen saturation 99%. All indicators suggested her body was tolerating the procedure exceptionally well. This appears to be a straightforward textbook case, Dr. Harrison observed with satisfaction as he began identifying critical anatomical structures surrounding the gallbladder. Her anatomy is remarkably clear, and I don't see any obvious complications. The surgical dissection proceeded methodically as Dr. Harrison worked to expose the hepatocystic triangle niche, the critical area where the gallbladder's blood supply and bile duct connections required precise identification and division. But as he continued careful dissection work, Dr. Harrison began noticing something unexpected. The gallbladder tissue, which had appeared straightforward on pre-operative imaging, showed signs of much more severe inflammation than anticipated. The tissue was significantly thicker, and more adherent to surrounding structures than typical. Interesting, doctor. Interesting, doctor. Harrison murmured, maintaining professional calm, despite the increased surgical complexity. We're seeing more inflammation than the studies suggested, but nothing we can't handle. This may add some time, but doesn't change our approach. Dr. Chen confirmed Mrs. Whitman's vital signs remained stable despite the longer operative time becoming necessary. As dissection continued, Dr. Harrison encountered increasingly dense adhesions, fibrous scar tissue bands connecting the gallbladder to nearby organs, indicating extensive previous inflammatory episodes. The inflammatory process is more complex than initially anticipated, he explained to his team, but I've handled much more difficult cases. We'll work carefully and complete this safely. The surgical technique required constant modification as chronic inflammation had distorted normal anatomical landmarks that usually guided dissection. Dr. Harrison, Nurse Martinez said quietly, should I prepare instruments for conversion to open surgery? Her suggestion reflected standard surgical wisdom, that when laparoscopic procedures become technically difficult, converting to open surgery through a larger incision was often safest. However, Dr. Harrison's pride in his technical abilities and perfect record made him reluctant to abandon the minimally invasive approach. Not yet, he replied firmly. I believe we can complete this laparoscopically. Mrs. Whitman will benefit significantly from avoiding a larger incision. It was a decision he would replay countless times. Was it appropriate surgical confidence or professional hubris? At the time, it seemed medically sound. He had successfully completed hundreds of challenging laparoscopic procedures. As he continued dissecting around the severely inflamed gallbladder, Dr. Harrison encountered tissue changes unlike anything in his experience. Chronic inflammation had created a three-dimensional maze of scar tissue that obscured normal anatomical relationships.
I'm seeing unusual tissue characteristics, he announced. The inflammatory process appears much more extensive than our pre-operative studies indicated. Then he observed something alarming. an aberrant blood vessel running through scar tissue where no vessel should exist according to normal anatomy. Chronic inflammation had caused formation of new vascular connections, creating an unpredictable blood supply network. We have aberrant vascular anatomy requiring extremely careful handling, Dr. Harrison said, his concentration now completely focused on the technical challenge. Working with microscopic precision, he attempted to dissect around the abnormal vessel while maintaining surrounding tissue integrity. Each movement required precise calculation. Vital signs remained stable, Dr. Chen reported. Blood pressure 120/75, heart rate 72. I'm going to divide this vessel very carefully, Dr. Harrison announced. Everyone maintained sharp focus. What happened next would haunt him for the rest of his life. As he applied a surgical clip to the aberrant vessel and divided it with electrocautery, the tissue reaction was immediate and catastrophic. The vessel, severely weakened by years of inflammation, didn't close as expected. Instead, it retracted into scar tissue and began bleeding at a rate that instantly transformed routine surgery into a life-threatening emergency. We have significant bleeding, Dr. Harrison announced, voice steady despite the crisis, major arterial bleeding from the hepatic bed. This is now a surgical emergency. Bright red blood rapidly filled the surgical field, every surgeon's nightmare. He immediately began aggressive suctioning, but bleeding occurred too rapidly for clear visualization of its source. Blood pressure dropping, Dr. Chen reported with sudden concern. 165 and falling. Converting to open surgery immediately, Dr. Harrison decided. We need direct access. Nurse Martinez, activate massive transfusion protocol. The operating room transformed from calm professionalism into controlled urgency as every team member responded to the crisis. Additional equipment was activated. Emergency medications prepared. Blood bank notified. The conversion required precious minutes while Mrs. Whitman continued bleeding internally. Dr. Harrison worked efficiently to create a larger incision, providing direct access to the bleeding source. Blood pressure now 85/50, Dr. Chen announced. Heart rate climbing to 95. Opening the abdomen revealed a field completely filled with blood. Working rapidly, he began systematic suctioning, attempting to identify bleeding vessels. There's the main bleeder, he said, attempting to grasp the vessel with forceps, but tissue was too damaged by inflammation to hold sutures reliably. Each attempt to control bleeding caused additional damage, creating new bleeding sources. Pressure continues dropping, Dr. Chen reported. 75/45. Starting blood transfusion. For 25 desperate minutes, Dr. Harrison employed every technique for controlling bleeding: direct suturing, clips, electrocautery, hemostatic agents. Nothing worked. Mrs. Whitman's inflammatory condition had created tissue that wouldn't respond to conventional methods. Having difficulty maintaining pressure despite multiple blood units, Dr. Chen said quietly. Dr. Harrison faced his most terrible realization. Despite his knowledge, skills, perfect record, and every modern medical resource, he was losing Mrs. Eleanor Whitman. Mrs. Whitman's pressure continued falling despite massive transfusion. Her heart rate became erratic as her system struggled against overwhelming blood loss. Blood pressure 60/30, Dr. Chen announced. Heart rate 130 and irregular. Dr. Harrison continued working desperately. But when pressure falls below critical levels too long, when vital organs are deprived of oxygen, the human body shuts down regardless of surgical expertise. Dr. Harrison, Dr. Chen said softly, I'm losing her. Words he'd never heard about his patients. Words for other surgeons, other failures, not his operating room where he controlled everything. No, he said firmly. As alarms sounded, not today. But at 11:34 a.m., Mrs. Eleanor Whitman's heart stopped beating. Harrison led intensive resuscitation for 30 minutes, chest compressions, emergency medications, direct cardiac massage. When every intervention was exhausted and her body showed no response, he stood over her still form, experiencing complete failure. Time of death 12:07 p.m., he announced quietly. When the room was finally empty, Dr. Harrison stood alone beside the table where Mrs. Eleanor Whitman had died under his care. For 15 years this had been his kingdom where success was guaranteed. He had proven human skill sufficient to control life and death. Now staring at hands that had failed, Dr. Harrison felt his worldview cracking. If he truly was God of this operating room, what did Mrs. Whitman's death make him? If he was responsible for every success, then he was responsible for this failure. The questions devastated him. Had pride cost her life? Most terrible. If human skill was sufficient to control life and death, why had it failed when he needed it most? For the first time in 30 years, since his pastor father abandoned their family, Dr. Harrison wondered if there might be something greater than human knowledge, more powerful than individual skill. Standing where his perfect record had died with Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, Dr. Michael Harrison began to understand that some questions couldn't be answered by medical textbooks, some failures couldn't be explained by science. The sterile operating room felt different now. The confidence that had guided every decision for 15 years was gone, replaced by crushing doubt about everything he thought he knew. He still had to face Mrs. Whitman's family, tell them their faith in him had been misplaced, watch their hope die as surely as their mother had died on his table. Dr. Harrison pulled off his surgical cap and ran fingers through his hair. His hands were steady, they always were, but something fundamental had shifted. The absolute certainty that had defined him was shattered, and that shattering was about to change everything. But as Dr. Harrison prepared to deliver the devastating news to Mrs. Whitman's family, he had no idea that someone was about to enter his life who would challenge everything he believed about power, control, and the true nature of life and death. What happened next would reveal not only the shocking truth about Mrs. Whitman's death, but also the real reason why a preacher's son had become medicine's most famous atheist.
Dr. Harrison stood frozen at the operating room door, his hand trembling on the handle. In 15 years of surgical practice, he had never faced this moment. Walking out to tell a family their loved one was gone. The conversations had always been triumphant, grateful families weeping with relief, thanking God while he modestly accepted praise, knowing the real credit belonged to his skill. Now everything had changed. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman lay dead behind him, and her family waited expecting good news that would never come. The weight of failure pressed down like a physical force, making each breath difficult. He forced himself to move. The familiar sounds of Chicago Memorial surrounded him. Soft beeping monitors, hushed conversations, distant elevator hums. But today these sounds seemed muted, as if the entire hospital held its breath in sympathy for his devastating loss. Dr. Patricia Williams intercepted him near the elevators, immediately recognizing something was seriously wrong. "Michael, what happened? You look terrible." "I lost her, Patricia," he said quietly, voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Mrs. Whitman died on the table. Massive hemorrhage from inflammatory tissue damage that wouldn't respond to any intervention." Dr. Williams went pale. In 8 years of working with Dr. Harrison, she had never heard those words from him. His perfect record was legendary. Residents spoke of it reverentially. Other surgeons privately envied his unprecedented success. "Michael, I'm so sorry. Do you need support with the family conference?" "No, this is my responsibility. I need to tell them myself." The surgical waiting lounge had been designed to provide comfort during stressful moments. Soft lighting, calming colors, comfortable seating arranged for privacy. But no design could make this space less painful when hope died and grief was born. Through the glass doors he could see the Whitmans in their corner near windows where morning sunlight still streamed through, creating an almost ethereal glow around their anxious forms. They had waited 4 hours, sustained by faith in both God and their surgeon. Jennifer was pacing near the windows, her heels clicking rhythmically. She had changed into comfortable clothes, bought dark jeans and a sweater that probably belonged to her mother. Robert sat rigidly with his laptop forgotten, staring at his phone. Amy had curled into a corner chair, clutching tissues and looking far younger than 21. They saw him approaching and immediately moved toward him, faces bright with expectation and relief. This was the moment they'd waited for. Zealous. The triumphant surgeon coming to tell them their prayers were answered. "Dr. Harrison," Jennifer called out, rushing toward him with joy. "Thank goodness you're finally here. We were starting to worry because it took so much longer than expected. But Mama's okay now, right? The surgery went well." The words hit him like physical blows. Their trust was absolute. They couldn't even conceive of failure. Jennifer's smile was radiant. Robert was standing to shake his hand. Amy was wiping away tears of relief. "Please," he managed, voice barely above a whisper. "Please sit down, all of you." The change in his tone was immediate and devastating. Jennifer's smile faltered as if someone had struck her. Robert's face went ashen as his lawyer's instincts recognized bad news. Amy's hand flew to her mouth, as if to prevent a scream. Is she okay?" Jennifer asked tentatively, though her voice already carried terrible knowledge. Dr. Harrison sat across from them, hands clasped tightly to keep them from shaking. There were complications during surgery, severe complications we couldn't have anticipated based on pre-operative studies. What kind of complications? Robert asked, his legal training kicking in even as his world crumbled. Was it medical error? Your mother's gallbladder was much more severely inflamed than our imaging indicated. The chronic inflammation had created extensive scar tissue and abnormal blood vessel formations. During the procedure, we encountered massive bleeding that we couldn't control despite every intervention available to modern medicine. But you fixed it, right? Amy whispered, young voice trembling with desperate hope. You're the best surgeon in Chicago. Everyone says so. You must have found a way. The absolute faith in her voice nearly destroyed his composure. For 15 years, he had basked in that trust, built his identity on being the surgeon who always found a way, who never failed. I'm so very sorry, Dr. Harrison said, his professional mask finally cracking. We did everything humanly possible. We employed every technique, every resource medical science has to offer. But we lost her. Your mother died at 12:07 this afternoon. The silence was deafening. Jennifer swayed as if the words were a physical blow. Robert sat perfectly still, his mind refusing to process what he'd heard. Amy stared with wide, uncomprehending eyes. No, Jennifer said finally, shaking her head violently. That's not possible. You don't lose patience, Dr. Everyone knows that. Your record is perfect. The words cut through him like surgical instruments. His perfect record, his reputation, his identity, all built on the assumption that human skill was sufficient to overcome any medical challenge. Now that assumption lay shattered. I am so deeply sorry for your loss, he managed. If there are any questions about what happened, I will answer them completely and honestly. Questions. Robert looked up sharply, grief transforming into focused anger. My mother was healthy. This was routine surgery. How does routine surgery kill a healthy person? Dr. Harrison spent 30 minutes explaining the medical details as gently as possible. The unexpected inflammation severity, aberrant blood vessel formations, tissue damage that made conventional repair. He walked them through every decision, every technique, every moment of the desperate battle to save their mother. But he could see the scientific explanation wasn't enough. They needed someone to blame, and he was the obvious target. She prayed before surgery, Amy said through tears, voice broken and confused. She spent hours on her knees last night, asking God to watch over her and guide your hands. She had complete faith everything would be okay. Those words would echo in Dr. Harrison's mind for years. Miss Whitman had trusted both God and her surgeon. Both had failed her absolutely. She also trusted you, Jennifer added, voice gaining strength as shock transformed into something harder. She chose you specifically because of your reputation. She believed the best surgeon in Chicago, guided by God's hand, would take care of her. The irony was devastating. For years Dr. Harrison had privately dismissed families who thanked God for his successes, secure that their gratitude was misdirected. Now, faced with his first failure, he found himself with no one to blame, but himself and no higher power to share responsibility. The family's grief was too raw for extended conversation. Dr. Harrison arranged for the hospital chaplain to meet with them, completed necessary paperwork, and answered immediate questions about funeral arrangements. Through it all he moved like a man in a nightmare. By 3:30 p.m., administrative duties were complete. Dr. Harrison had canceled his remaining surgeries, something he'd never done except for genuine emergencies. He retreated to his office, a spacious corner suite reflecting his status as one of Chicago Memorial's most valuable physicians. The walls were lined with diplomas, awards and photographs with famous patients and colleagues. A large bookshelf held medical textbooks and journals documenting the latest advances. Everything spoke of achievement, expertise, and success. None of it meant anything now. The diplomas seemed like meaningless paper, the photographs like monuments to vanity, the books like collections of information that had proven inadequate when needed most. His computer showed 17 new emails from colleagues who'd heard rumors and wanted to offer support. The medical community was small. News of Dr. Harrison's first patient death would spread quickly. Some would offer genuine sympathy. Others would privately feel satisfaction that the seemingly perfect surgeon had finally been brought down. Dr. Harrison ignored the emails and constantly ringing phone. He wasn't ready to talk about what happened, wasn't prepared to accept condolences or answer questions about his medical decisions. He needed time to process the fundamental shift in his understanding of himself and his profession. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. "Dr. Harrison." His secretary's voice was gentle and concerned. "There's someone here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's important and about Mrs. Whitman." Dr. Harrison's first thought was a lawyer already. "Is he an attorney?" "He didn't say, sir. He's well. He's quite different from our usual visitors. Very calm, very peaceful. He asked specifically to speak with you privately." Something in Mrs. Chen's tone made Dr. Harrison curious despite his exhaustion. She had met thousands of visitors and was not easily impressed or mystified. "Different how?" "It's difficult to explain. He has a very unusual presence, almost like he doesn't quite belong to this world. I know that sounds strange, but there's something about him unlike anyone I've ever met." Under normal circumstances, Dr. Harrison would have dismissed such description as nonsense, but nothing about this day had been normal. "Send him in." Mrs. Chen nodded and disappeared. A moment later the door opened, and a man entered who immediately commanded Dr. Harrison's complete attention in a way he couldn't explain. The visitor appeared to be in his early 30s, of average height with a lean but strong build. His dark hair fell to his shoulders, and he wore a well-groomed beard, framing a face of remarkable serenity. His clothing was simple tan chinos, white cotton shirt, brown leather sandals that seemed oddly informal, but somehow perfectly appropriate. But it was his eyes that struck Dr. Harrison most powerfully. Dark brown, almost black, but filled with such profound compassion that looking into them felt like being embraced by infinite love. There was wisdom that seemed to span centuries, pain that spoke of deep suffering, and peace that transcended any earthly experience. "Dr. Harrison," the man said, his voice soft but carrying impossible authority. "Thank you for seeing me. I know this has been an incredibly difficult day." "Who are you?" Dr. Harrison asked, extending his hand in automatic courtesy. "Are you here about Mrs. Whitman?" The handshake was firm and warm, and Dr. Harrison felt unexpected comfort from the contact. "My name is Jesus," he said simply, "and yes, I'm here about Eleanor Whitman, though not in the way you might expect." Dr. Harrison blinked hard, certain the stress was affecting his hearing. "I'm sorry, did you say your name was Jesus?" "I did. That's quite unusual in this context." "Many things about today will seem unusual, Michael." The use of his first name by a complete stranger should have been jarring, but somehow felt natural coming from this man. "Dr. Harrison gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Please, sit down. How can I help you?" Jesus settled into the chair with fluid grace, his presence immediately transforming the sterile office, making it feel warmer and more peaceful. "I'm actually here to help you, Michael. I appreciate the sentiment, but I don't think anyone can help me right now. I just lost my first patient in 15 years. My perfect record is destroyed, and a good woman is dead because of my decisions." "Is that what you truly believe? That Eleanor Whitman died because of your decisions?" Dr. Harrison felt irritation at what seemed like a naive question. "Are you a physician, a grief counselor?" "Because I've already spoken with the hospital's psychological services team." "I'm neither," Jesus replied calmly. "I'm someone who understands the weight of carrying responsibility for life and death. Someone who knows what it's like to be blamed for outcomes beyond human control." Despite his apparent youth, Jesus spoke with gravity of someone who had experienced profound loss and understood suffering intimately. Mrs. Whitman died because her tissue was too damaged by chronic inflammation to respond to surgical repair. Dr. Harrison said, "The bleeding couldn't be controlled using any technique available to modern medicine. And yet you blame yourself." "I'm the surgeon. The responsibility was mine."
Was it? Jesus leaned forward slightly, dark eyes never leaving Dr. Harrison's face. "Tell me, when you became a surgeon, did you take an oath to control life and death, or to use your skills to heal when possible?" The question caught Dr. Harrison off guard, challenging assumptions he'd made so long ago he'd forgotten they were assumptions rather than facts. The Hippocratic Oath speaks about doing no harm, about using medical knowledge to benefit patients. It doesn't promise that every patient will be saved. "No, but," Dr. Harrison trailed off, struggling with thoughts he'd never articulated. "My record was perfect. 3,247 surgeries without a single death. That had to mean something." "It means you're an exceptionally skilled surgeon,
who was blessed with cases that fell within the realm of human capability to heal. Blessed? Dr. Harrison's voice hardened. I don't believe in blessings. I believe in skill, knowledge, and preparation. Jesus smiled with infinite sadness. Yes, I know. You've believed that since you were 15 years old, when your father left and you decided that if God existed, he was either powerless or indifferent. Dr. Harrison felt his blood turn cold. How could you possibly know that? Because I was there, Michael. I was there when young Michael Harrison knelt beside his bed every night, praying for his father to come home. I was there when he found the note on the kitchen table. I was there when his mother died, still wearing her wedding ring, still believing her husband would return. The office seemed to spin as impossible knowledge poured from this stranger's lips. Details he'd never shared with anyone, memories he'd buried deeply, were being recounted with perfect accuracy. Who are you really? He whispered. I told you, my name is Jesus. That's impossible. Are you a private investigator? How could you know these things about my childhood? Jesus stood and walked to the window overlooking Chicago. The afternoon sun created a halo effect around his silhouette, making him appear almost ethereal. I know because I've been watching you for 30 years, Michael. I've been present for every surgery, every success, every moment when families thanked God and you silently took credit. I've watched you build your identity on the belief that human achievement is superior to divine grace. This is insane, Dr. Harrison said, backing away from his desk. You're delusional, and I'm calling security. Before you do, Jesus said, turning with a smile both gentle and commanding, let me ask something only someone with intimate knowledge of your career could ask. In all your years of surgery, have you ever encountered a case exactly like Mrs. Whitman's? Have you ever seen tissue damage so extensive it defied every repair method you knew? Dr. Harrison hesitated, hand frozen halfway to the phone. It was true, Mrs. Whitman's case had been unlike anything in his experience or medical literature. Medical anomalies happen, he said without conviction. This wasn't an anomaly, Michael. This was a reminder. A reminder of what? That some things are beyond human control, no matter how skilled the hands or brilliant the mind. Jesus returned to his chair, and Dr. Harrison found himself sitting as well, drawn by inexplicable magnetism. The peace surrounding Jesus was almost tangible. Eleanor Whitman's tissue damage was caused by a rare genetic condition, creating abnormal inflammatory responses. Jesus explained with medical precision. No imaging could have detected it. No surgical technique could have compensated. Her death wasn't a failure of your skill. It was a limitation of human medicine. How could you know about a genetic condition not documented in her medical history? The same way I know you've been having the same nightmare for 30 years. The one where you're 15, searching every room for a father who will never return. Dr. Harrison felt his legs give way as he collapsed into his chair. The nightmare Jesus described was real. He'd had that exact dream repeatedly for 3 decades, though he'd never told anyone. This isn't possible, you can't know these things. I know because I've been with you through every moment of pain, every triumph, every decision. I was there when you chose surgery, to prove humans could conquer death without divine assistance. I was there when you succeeded brilliantly, building a perfect record that convinced you that you'd become your own God. Stop, Dr. Harrison said weakly. I was there today, Michael, when you realized that even gods can fail. Tears began streaming down Dr. Harrison's face for the first time since his mother's funeral. All the emotion he'd been suppressing poured out in wrenching sobs from the deepest parts of his soul. If you're who you claim to be, he managed through tears, then where were you when I needed you? Where were you when my father abandoned us? Where were you when my mother died, believing in something that wasn't real? Jesus' expression filled with infinite sadness and compassion. I was there carrying your pain as my own. I was there when you decided you couldn't trust me anymore. I was there every day for 30 years, waiting for you to understand that your father's failure of faith wasn't my failure of love. But you let it all happen. You let him leave. You let her die. I let human beings make their own choices. Yes, your father chose fear over faith, abandonment over responsibility. But his choices weren't mine, any more than Mrs. Whitman's death was yours. Dr. Harrison looked up through his tears, searching this impossible visitor's face for answers to questions he'd been asking for decades. Then what's the point? What's the point of faith if it doesn't protect us from suffering? Faith isn't protection from suffering, Michael. Jesus replied gently. Faith is the knowledge that you're not alone in your suffering. Jesus reached across and touched Dr. Harrison's hand. The contact was overwhelming in its warmth, comfort and sense of absolute acceptance. I never asked you to be perfect. I never asked you to save every patient. I only asked you to use the gifts I gave you with humility and love. The gifts you gave me, your healing hands, your brilliant mind, your compassionate heart. Did you think those came from nowhere? For the first time in 30 years, Dr. Harrison felt the presence of something greater than himself, not as a threat, but as a source of love that valued him not for his achievements, but simply for existing. Mrs. Whitman, he began. Eleanor is at peace, Jesus said with certainty. She understood, even dying, that some battles can't be won by human effort alone. She wasn't angry with you, Michael. She was grateful for your skill and dedication, even though they weren't sufficient to save her. How can you know what she was thinking? Jesus smiled, and for an instant his appearance seemed to glow with inner light having nothing to do with office fluorescence. Because I was with her too. I held her hand as she passed from this life to the next. Her last conscious thought wasn't fear or anger. It was prayer for the surgeon who had tried so desperately to save her. Dr. Harrison stared at the man across from him, his scientific mind warring with something deeper, recognition of truth that transcended explanation. Who are you really? He whispered. I am the one who wept when Lazarus died, even knowing I would raise him. I am the one who healed the sick and comforted the grieving. I am the one who understands carrying the weight of others' pain. The words hung like revelation, and Dr. Harrison felt 30 years of atheism, cracking like a dam under pressure. I am the one your father preached about before his faith failed. I am the one your mother prayed to until her dying breath. I am the one you've been running from since you were 15, convinced I had abandoned you. Jesus, Dr. Harrison whispered, speaking the name as recognition, confession, and prayer. Yes, but that's impossible. You're supposed to be dead, resurrected, ascended. Jesus' eyes twinkled with gentle humor. I am all those things and more. I am also here with you when you need me most. Dr. Harrison's worldview was reshaping with every heartbeat. Everything he'd believed about reality, existence, the relationship between science and faith, was being rewritten by an encounter that should have been impossible but felt more real than anything he'd experienced. Why now? Why reveal yourself after 30 years? I was never silent, Michael. You couldn't hear me over your own achievements. Success made you deaf to anything beyond your capabilities. Failure has opened your ears to truths you couldn't perceive before. Jesus stood, and Dr. Harrison found himself rising as well, drawn by inexplicable magnetism. Your work as a healer isn't finished. There are still lives to save, still suffering to relieve. But from now on you'll do it knowing you're not carrying the burden alone. I don't know how to have faith again, Dr. Harrison admitted. I don't know how to trust in something I can't see or prove. Faith isn't about seeing or proving, Michael. Faith is about knowing that love is real, even when it can't be quantified. Jesus moved toward the door, and Dr. Harrison felt panic at being left alone with his questions. Will I see you again? Jesus turned back with a smile containing all the love in the universe. Every time you choose compassion over pride, every time you admit you don't have all the answers, every time you offer comfort to someone suffering, you'll see me. What about Mrs. Whitman's family? How do I continue practicing medicine knowing I'm not the surgeon I thought I was? You face them with humility instead of pride, with compassion instead of defensiveness. You continue practicing not because you're perfect, but because you're human, limited, fallible, and therefore capable of genuine empathy with others who suffer. Jesus paused at the door one final time. Eleanor's family will struggle with grief, but they will heal. Your colleagues will support you in ways that will surprise you, and you will discover that being human, acknowledging limitations, accepting your need for help, is not weakness to overcome but truth to embrace. Thank you, Dr. Harrison said, though the words seemed inadequate. Thank you, Michael, for finally being ready to listen. And then Jesus was gone, leaving Dr. Harrison alone with a completely transformed understanding of himself, his profession, and his place in a universe far more mysterious and meaningful than he'd ever imagined. For the first time in 30 years, Dr. Michael Harrison knelt beside his chair and prayed, not to prove anything or achieve anything, but simply to acknowledge his gratitude for love that had never abandoned him, even when he had abandoned it. Dr. Harrison's encounter with Jesus had shattered everything he thought he knew about life, death, and his own abilities, but as he knelt in prayer for the first time in 3 decades, He had no idea that his transformation was just beginning. The days ahead would test his newfound faith in ways he never imagined, and reveal that sometimes the greatest healing happens not in the operating room, but in the human heart.
6 months had passed since that transformative Tuesday when Dr. Michael Harrison's perfect record and his atheist worldview both died in operating room 7. The man who once declared himself God of his operating room had become someone entirely different, humbler, more compassionate, and infinitely more effective as a healer. The changes were evident to everyone at Chicago Memorial Hospital. Where Dr. Harrison had once walked the corridors with clinical detachment, he now stopped to comfort anxious families in waiting rooms. Where he had once focused solely on surgical technique, he now prayed silently before each procedure, not for perfection, but for wisdom and peace regardless of the outcome. His surgical skills, rather than diminishing after his loss of absolute confidence, had somehow become even more refined. Freed from the crushing pressure of maintaining a perfect record, Dr. Harrison operated with a grace and intuition that amazed his colleagues. He had learned to trust not only his training, but also the quiet voice that sometimes guided his hands during the most critical moments. The lawsuit that everyone expected from the Whitman family never materialized. Instead, something extraordinary had happened in the weeks following Eleanor's death. Jennifer, Robert, and Amy had each experienced their own encounters with healing, not the physical kind that medicine provided, but the spiritual restoration that only forgiveness could bring. Jennifer had returned to the hospital 3 weeks after her mother's funeral, asking to speak with Dr. Harrison privately. When they met in the same conference room where he had first delivered the devastating news, she had surprised him completely. "Doctor," she had said, her eyes still red with grief but somehow peaceful, "I came to tell you that we don't blame you for what happened to Mama. After the anger faded and we had time to think clearly, we realized that you did everything humanly possible to save her. Sometimes that has to be enough." Dr. Harrison had wept openly, then overwhelmed by grace he hadn't expected and didn't feel he deserved. "Your forgiveness means more to me than I can express," he had replied. "Your mother was blessed to have a family that loved her so completely. She was blessed to have a surgeon who cared enough to fight so hard for her life." Jennifer had responded, "Mama would want you to know that her faith wasn't shaken by what happened. If anything, it was strengthened. She always said that God's plan was bigger than our understanding." That conversation had marked a turning point not just for Dr. Harrison but for his entire approach to medicine. He began spending time with patients before surgery, listening to their fears and hopes, sharing in their humanity rather than viewing them merely as medical cases to be solved. The change was perhaps most evident in his relationship with medical students and residents. Where he had once intimidated young doctors with his perfection and impossible standards, he now mentored them with patience and understanding. He told them about Mrs. Whitman during their surgical rotations, using his greatest failure as a teaching tool about humility, limitation, and the true purpose of healing. "Medicine is not about playing God," he would tell them during rounds. "It's about serving as instruments of healing while recognizing that we are not in control of every outcome. Our job is to use our skills with excellence and compassion, then trust that we've done our part in a much larger plan." Dr. Harrison had also begun volunteering at a free clinic in one of Chicago's poorest neighborhoods, donating his time to patients who could never afford his usual fees. It was there, treating people with no insurance and limited resources, that he discovered what medicine was truly meant to be, one not a showcase for surgical prowess, but an expression of love for fellow human beings who suffered. The clinic was run by Father Miguel Santos, a Catholic priest who had been serving the community for over 20 years. Father Santos had welcomed Dr. Harrison's offer to volunteer with knowing smile, as if he had been expecting this particular surgeon to find his way to their humble facility. "God has a way of bringing us exactly where we need to be," Father Santos had said during Dr. Harrison. "Sometimes we think we're helping others, but really they're helping us discover who we're meant to become." Those words proved prophetic. Working with patients who had nothing but their faith to sustain them through medical crises, Dr. Harrison learned lessons about courage, hope, and trust that no medical textbook had ever taught him. He watched terminally ill patients comfort their own families, saw people with chronic pain volunteer to help others worse off than themselves, witnessed faith that remained unshaken even when healing didn't come. One patient in particular had profoundly impacted him: Maria Rodriguez, a 60-year-old woman with advanced diabetes, who came to the clinic for regular care. Despite having lost her vision and facing potential amputation of her foot,
Maria radiated joy and gratitude that put Dr. Harrison's former complaints about surgical complications into perspective. "Doctor," she had said during one of her visits, "I heard you lost your first patient some months ago. I want you to know that I pray for you every day." "You pray for me, Doctor?" Harrison had asked, amazed that someone facing such serious health challenges would spend time praying for her physician. "Shouldn't I be praying for you?" Maria had laughed, her face lighting up despite her blindness. "Doctor, we're all in this together. God doesn't love you any less because you couldn't save one person. If anything, He probably loves you more because you cared enough to be heartbroken about it." Her simple wisdom had stayed with him for weeks, reminding him daily that his worth as a person and as a healer wasn't determined by his success rate, but by his willingness to care deeply about those he served. The transformation in Dr. Harrison's personal life had been equally dramatic. He had begun attending church again for the first time since childhood, not because he felt obligated, but because he hungered for community with others who understood that life contained mysteries beyond scientific explanation. He had found a small Episcopal congregation where the pastor, Reverend Sarah Williams, preached about a God who suffered alongside humanity rather than controlling every outcome from a distance. Dr. Harrison had even reached out to his estranged half-sister Catherine, whom he hadn't spoken to since their father's abandonment 30 years earlier. Catherine had moved to Seattle after college and started her own family, but had always wondered about the brother she had lost to anger and hurt. Their reunion, tentative at first, had blossomed into a relationship that helped heal wounds Dr. Harrison hadn't even realized were still bleeding. "I used to be so angry at Dad," Catherine had told him during one of their long phone conversations, "but I finally realized that staying angry was just giving him continued power to hurt us. Forgiveness isn't about saying what he did was okay, it's about refusing to let his choices define the rest of our lives." Her perspective had helped Dr. Harrison understand his own journey toward forgiving not just his father but himself for the years of pride and isolation that had followed that childhood abandonment. Now, as Dr. Harrison prepared for another day of surgery at Chicago Memorial, he reflected on how completely his life had changed. He no longer approached each operation with the crushing pressure of maintaining perfection. Instead, he entered each surgery with a prayer for wisdom, a commitment to excellence, and an acceptance that some outcomes were beyond human control. His first case of the day was a complex cardiac procedure on a 5-year-old boy named Timothy Chen, who had been born with multiple heart defects. The surgery was risky, with only a 60% chance of success according to the medical literature. The old Dr. Harrison would have been consumed with anxiety about the potential impact on his reputation if the operation failed. The new Dr. Harrison was focused entirely on giving Timothy the best possible chance at a normal childhood. As he scrubbed in for surgery, Dr. Harrison found himself thinking about Mrs. Eleanor Whitman and the lesson her death had taught him. She had died not because of any failure on his part, but because human medicine had limits that even the most skilled surgeon couldn't transcend. That limitation, rather than being a source of shame, had become a source of freedom. Freed from the impossible burden of playing God, he could focus on the calling he had always been meant to fulfill, being a healer who served with excellence, compassion and humility. The surgery on Timothy Chen took 4 hours, and proceeded with remarkable smoothness. Every incision was precise, every suture perfectly placed, every decision guided by both medical knowledge and an intuitive sense of rightness that Dr. Harrison had learned to trust. When Timothy's repaired heart began beating with strong, regular rhythm, the entire operating team broke into spontaneous applause. But the moment that meant the most to Dr. Harrison came later, in the recovery room, when Timothy's parents were allowed to see their son for the first time after surgery. As the little boy opened his eyes and smiled weakly at his mother and father, Dr. Harrison felt the presence he had learned to recognize, the quiet but unmistakable awareness that he was not alone in his work. "Thank you, Doctor," Timothy's mother whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for giving us our son back." "Thank God, Dr. Harrison replied, and meant it completely. "Thank God for giving all of us another chance to witness a miracle." As he left the hospital that evening, Dr. Harrison paused in the lobby to look at a new addition to the memorial wall where the names of patients who had died at Chicago Memorial were honored. Among hundreds of names etched in black marble, he found the one he visited every week, Eleanor Rose Whitman, beloved mother, grandmother and teacher. Below her name, her family had chosen to inscribe the words that had defined her life: "Her faith made others whole." Dr. Harrison touched the inscription gently, as he did every week, and whispered a prayer of gratitude for the woman whose death had taught him how to truly live. Then he walked out into the Chicago evening, no longer the surgeon who had declared himself God of his operating room, but something infinitely better, a healer who knew he was loved, forgiven, and called to serve something greater than himself. 6 blocks from the hospital doctor, Harrison stopped at a small coffee shop where he had become a regular customer. The owner, Mrs. Park, always saved him a table by the window where he could watch the city come alive with evening lights. As he sat with his coffee, reading through patient files for the next day, a man approached his table.
"Excuse me, are you Dr. Harrison?" the stranger asked. Dr. Harrison looked up to see a man in his 40s, wearing simple work clothes and a nervous expression. "Yes, I am. Can I help you?" "My name is David Whitman," the man said, extending his hand. "Eleanor Whitman was my mother, Dr." Harrison's heart stopped. Eleanor Whitman had had only 3 children, Jennifer, Robert, and Amy. He had never heard of a son named David. I'm sorry, I think there might be some confusion," Dr. Harrison stammered. "Your mother had 3 children, and I met them all." David smiled sadly. "I was estranged from the family, had been for 15 years because of my addiction problems. I only learned about Mom's death weeks later, and by then, the funeral was over, and my siblings wanted nothing to do with me." Dr. Harrison gestured for David to sit down, his mind racing. "I'm so sorry for your loss. Your mother was a remarkable woman. I know you tried everything to save her," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "Jennifer finally told me what happened, how hard you fought for her life. I wanted to thank you for that, and to tell you something that might sound strange." "What's that?" David leaned forward, his eyes intense but peaceful. 3 weeks after Mom died, I was living on the streets, using drugs to numb the pain of losing her. And knowing I'd never gotten to say goodbye, I was ready to end it all. But then I met someone, a man who looked exactly like the Jesus pictures Mom used to have all over her house. Dr. Harrison felt his pulse quicken. "What did he say to you?" "He told me that Mom had forgiven me years ago, even though I'd never asked for it. He said she had prayed for me every single day since I left home, and that her last prayer before surgery was for her whole family, including me. He told me that Mom's death wasn't anyone's fault, but that her life could still have meaning if I chose to honor her memory by getting clean." David pulled out a sobriety chip marked 6 months and placed it on the table. "I've been sober ever since that conversation. I'm working construction now, have an apartment, even started going to the church where Mom used to pray. But here's the thing that might sound crazy. When that man finished talking to me, he just disappeared. One moment he was there, the next he was gone." Dr. Harrison stared at the young man across from him, remembering his own impossible encounter 6 months earlier. "David, can I ask you something? What did this man look like, exactly?" David described the visitor in perfect detail. The shoulder-length dark hair, the kind eyes, the simple clothing, the overwhelming sense of peace that surrounded him. Every word matched Dr. Harrison's own memory of Jesus. "He gave me something else," David continued, reaching into his pocket. "He said to give this to the surgeon who tried to save my mother, if I ever met him." David placed a small object on the table. It was a simple wooden cross, roughly carved but smooth from handling. As Dr. Harrison picked it up, he felt the same warmth, the same sense of presence, that he had experienced in his office 6 months ago. "He said to tell you that your work is just beginning," David continued. "That Mom's death was not the end of her story, but the beginning of something bigger. He said you would understand what that meant." Dr. Harrison held the wooden cross, tears flowing freely down his face. Through Mrs. Whitman's death, he had not only found his faith, but had become the kind of doctor he was always meant to be. Through his newfound humility and compassion, he had touched countless lives at the free clinic and inspired a new generation of medical students to see their profession as a calling rather than just a career. But now he understood that the ripples extended even further. Mrs. Whitman's prayers for her lost son had been answered through the very tragedy that had seemed to mock the power of prayer. Her death had led to his transformation, which had led to David's salvation, which would undoubtedly lead to other lives being touched and changed. "David," Dr. Harrison said, his voice thick with emotion, "would you like to hear about your mother's last day? About how brave she was, how much she trusted,
how her faith never wavered even in her final moments. David nodded eagerly, and for the next hour, Dr. Harrison shared every detail he could remember about Eleanor Whitman, her kindness to the hospital staff, her concern for her family, her peaceful acceptance of the risks involved in surgery. He painted a picture of a woman whose faith had been so strong that it continued to work miracles even after her death. When their conversation ended, David stood to leave, but paused at the table. "Doctor, there's one more thing. The man who visited me, he said to tell you that you're exactly where you're supposed to be. He said that sometimes God's greatest work is done through broken vessels." As David walked away into the Chicago night, Dr. Harrison sat alone with the wooden cross, understanding finally and completely that his journey from pride to humility, from self-reliance to faith, from perfect surgeon to broken healer, had been part of a plan much larger than he could have imagined. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman had not died in vain. Her death had cracked open a heart that pride had hardened, restored a faith that abandonment had destroyed, and set in motion a chain of healing that would continue long after Dr. Harrison himself was gone. For the first time in 6 months, Dr. Harrison allowed himself to smile at the memory of Mrs. Whitman lying peacefully on the operating table, trusting completely in both her surgeon and her God. Both had served her faithfully, though not in the way anyone had expected. He had learned that the greatest healing wasn't always about saving lives, sometimes it was about transforming them, and sometimes, the doctor needed healing more than the patient. As Dr. Harrison walked home through the streets of Chicago, the wooden cross warm in his palm, he whispered a prayer of gratitude for the woman whose death had taught him how to live, the family whose forgiveness had taught him about grace, and the Savior whose presence had never left him, even when he had forgotten how to look. Dr. Michael Harrison, former atheist and self-proclaimed god of his operating room, had finally learned the most important lesson of all, that the greatest healing comes not from human hands, but from a love that transcends understanding, transforms failure into purpose, and makes even the most broken vessels fit for service in the kingdom of heaven. In the distance, church bells began to chime the hour, and Dr. Harrison smiled, knowing that he would never again mistake the sound for meaningless noise. Everything had meaning now, everything was connected, everything was grace, even death, especially death. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman would have been proud. The end. What an incredible journey we've just witnessed together. Dr. Michael Harrison's transformation from an arrogant atheist surgeon who believed he was God of his operating room, to a humble faith-filled healer shows us one of life's most profound truths. Sometimes our greatest failures become our most important victories. When we first met Dr. Harrison, he had everything the world says should make us happy: success, wealth, a perfect record, complete control over his domain. Yet he was empty inside, carrying 30 years of pain from his father's abandonment and his mother's broken heart. He had built walls so high around his soul that even God couldn't reach him, or so he thought. But God never stopped trying. Through every successful surgery, through every moment of pride, through every declaration that he needed no divine help, Jesus was there, waiting, watching, loving unconditionally. It took the shattering of Dr. Harrison's perfect record, and the death of sweet Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, to finally crack open that hardened heart. What moves me most about this story is how Mrs. Whitman's death, which seemed like a tragedy, became the catalyst for incredible transformation, not just for Dr. Harrison but for her own lost son David, for countless patients at the free clinic, for medical students learning that healing is about more than technique, it's about love. The most powerful moment, when Jesus revealed himself in that hospital office, not as a condemning judge, but as a loving Savior who had been carrying Dr. Harrison's pain all along. "I was there," Jesus said, "carrying your pain as my own." That's the heart of the gospel. A God who doesn't abandon us in our suffering, but enters into it with us. Dr. Harrison thought he was the surgeon, but Jesus was performing the real surgery on a heart hardened by abandonment, pride and self-reliance. Sometimes God has to break us before he can remake us. Sometimes our greatest wounds become the source of our greatest ministry. This story challenges all of us. How many times do we try to be God of our own lives? How often do we mistake success for significance? When have we let past hurts blind us to present love? Dr. Harrison's journey reminds us that it's never too late for transformation, never too late for faith, never too late to discover that we're not alone in this world. The beautiful truth is that God specializes in using broken vessels. Mrs. Whitman's death wasn't wasted, it became the seed of healing for multiple lives. David got sober, Dr. Harrison found faith, countless patients received care, and the ripple effects continue spreading. That's how God works, taking what seems like defeat and turning it into victory. Mrs. Whitman's inscription was perfect. Her faith made others whole. Even in death, her faith continued to heal hearts and restore broken dreams. What a legacy, what a reminder that our lives matter more than we know. The wooden cross David gave Dr. Harrison represents something beautiful, that our pain, when surrendered to God, becomes the very instrument of our healing and the healing of others. The cross has always been God's way of transforming the worst into the best. As we close this powerful story, I'm reminded that each of us has areas where we try to play God. Relationships we try to control, circumstances we think we can handle alone, pride that keeps us from admitting our need for help. Dr. Harrison's journey shows us there's freedom in surrender, peace in humility, and joy in acknowledging we're part of something bigger than ourselves. Now I want to hear from you. This story touches on so many deep themes: faith after abandonment, finding purpose through failure, the difference between success and significance, forgiveness, and divine encounters in everyday life. Here's my question for you: have you ever had a moment like Dr. Harrison's where what seemed like your greatest failure actually became the doorway to your greatest transformation? Maybe it was losing a job that led to finding your true calling, a relationship ending that taught you about real love, or a health scare that changed your priorities completely. Share your story in the comments below. How did God use what felt like defeat to create victory in your life? What failures have you seen transformed into unexpected blessings? I read every comment and love hearing how these stories connect with your own journey of faith, hope, and healing.